Hey guys, it's Adam. We're planning on doing a new horror series on this channel where we read true and/or original horror stories from Reddit and a bunch of other places. If you'd like to submit stories of your own, email us. Our email is in the description. We hope you enjoy. Everybody has horror stories from their trips to the post office. Awful wait times, unruly customers, the clerk is an asshole, trying to ship something sucks, and you've probably heard them all. Mine is a little different. I work for the post office as a custodian, worked there for the past 6 years. The pay is great and the benefits are wonderful. I can't complain about the low level of difficulty the job entails either. Hell, I spent most of my day barely doing anything, but I don't tell my boss that. I started off in my hometown at a pretty local office as a non-career employee and did that for 3 years. At this point, I'm convinced that every office is just the creepiest building. The one I worked at then had so many eerie, dark hallways and freaky little rooms. I wouldn't be surprised if it was haunted. 3 years ago, I made regular and moved to an office about half an hour away. My job was split between 2 different offices, and I loved it. Fortunately for me, being a giant scaredy cat, neither of the offices I needed to go to freaked me out. One is newer, the other is just a garage, nothing too unsettling there. About 6 months ago, my job got changed to a split between the newer office and the much older main office. It's a pretty huge building and has an upper floor as well as a basement. They're both pretty deserted most of the time. If I'm on either of those floors, I always get that paranoid, I'm feeling watched or followed feeling. Always. I mean, the brunt of the basement is pretty fucking creepy on its own. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard some inexplicable noises down there. Some strange tapping, footsteps when there's nobody there. I can even name a few times I've heard some quiet, distant voice off in the darkness. It really freaks me out being down there sometimes. A pretty large amount of activity that I've encountered down there comes out of the boiler room. I remember filling up a mop bucket at the sink in there and hearing what I thought was a woman's voice, very quiet, calling something out to me. I couldn't quite make out the words and I don't remember them very well now, but I think it was almost calling for some kind of help. I've heard similar voices a few times after that, but they always sound a little different and always female. About 3 weeks ago, I was heading towards the supply area. To get to it, I have to cross this small, cramped hallway that passes by this kind of spooky stairwell that, as far as I know, hasn't been used in years. When I entered the hallway, I had to stop dead in my tracks. I heard footsteps on those stairs. They were a series of slow, heavy steps. It sounded like they'd get near the bottom and suddenly restart at the top. I couldn't explain it, and nobody ever popped up at the bottom of them. I ran back upstairs to look through the small window on the exit door leading out to the deserted lobby. Maybe someone was just messing with me. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone in that stairwell. I ran back down to the basement, and sure enough, I could still hear those footsteps loud and clear. Only now, they'd been interspersed with what sounded like tapping in the banister. I figured that I should record it. I didn't think anyone else would believe what I was hearing. After about 30 seconds of recording, the tapping changed. It became loud and almost aggressive. And frankly, it scared the proverbial shit out of me. I got the fuck out of there as quickly as I could. The next day, I was telling my coworker Steve about the noises I had heard. He's worked at this office for a little over 20 years. I figured he'd be able to supply me with some sort of an explanation. "You've heard it too, huh?" Steve had asked me. "About time. I'm surprised you never heard that sooner." Curious now, I asked him what he meant by that. "Well, about 30 years ago, used to be a guy named Paul that worked here as a custodian. As the story goes, he spent a lot of his time fucking around and pacing up and down those stairs. He'd spend hours at a time doing nothing but that, or so they say. One day in December of '89, though, things took a tragic turn for Paul, so I've heard." I tilted my head, more inquisitive than anything now. "Oh? Go on." Steve nodded. Supposedly, the dude suffered from a mean bout of depression. Rough childhood, no wife or kids or anything, parents died young, all that good shit. I guess, despite his tendency to screw off at work, it was the only place he felt at home, which was pretty ironic, seeing as most people here at the time didn't like the guy, found him weird and fairly creepy. Stood around corners just staring at people, never made an effort to make any friends or really communicate. Nothing. Just stayed silent and paced in that stairwell. I had a decent idea where this was going at this point, but I asked Steve to continue anyway. He obliged. So this particular December afternoon, nobody had heard from Paul at all. Nobody saw him around that day, nobody got any calls saying he'd been out or sick or something. Nothing. So one of the supervisors remembered his nice little hiding place and went down there to check. She found Paul, alright. Only he was hanging from the upper floor of the stairs by his neck. Dude used a length of power cord that was up there. I'm told the poor woman had to quit that day and needed some pretty extensive therapy. I guess it really fucked her up. Most of the old-timers still here from then say you can still hear him pacing up those stairs from time to time. Which it sure sounds like you did, Alex. I stood there, silently for a few moments, doing nothing but blinking. You mean to tell me this fucking basement is actually haunted? Fucking Christ, Steve. Hey man, that's just what I've heard. Your story fits right in the mix. I nodded. Fair enough. Though I had one more question for Steve. That doesn't explain those weird female voices I'd been hearing from the boiler room, though. Steve tensed up for a moment, hesitant to respond, but he did so with a light note of caution to his voice. Well, Alex, there's another part to Paul's story that people tend to not want to talk about. It's pretty fucked up, so just say the word if you actually want me to continue. Thinking for a moment, I nodded my head. Yeah, keep going. I want the full story. Steve nodded in turn and complied.
A lot of the guys here, they say the reason Paul was such a creepy loner, the guy was a goddamn serial killer. He'd kidnap a random woman every couple of months, bring him here to his sanctuary, and slit their throats in the boiler room. But they never found any of the bodies.
I've been working at an elementary school as a custodian for over a year now. It pays well, and I'm pretty much left alone to do my section. The school itself was built in the early 60s, with an addition built in 2004. I currently maintain the first floor on the original building, which has about 11 classrooms and 7 bathrooms. It has its moments, but it's a rewarding job with great government benefits and a salary that can maintain my bills. When I first started, my boss said something peculiar that I never really understood. He was giving me the rundown of the building about an hour before my first shift, which started at 3 p.m. He didn't really look at me when he said it, so I just kind of put it in the back of my head. It wasn't until last week, when some strange things began to happen, that I remember that he told me.
Always stay in the light.
Such a strange thing to say, right? I never really gave it much thought. The guy was quirky to begin with, and he never really seemed to be all there. But he was there for 30 years after all, and I guess when you stay in a job that long, your brain begins to misfire. So, my first year went without a hitch. I cleaned the rooms, and when winter came, I helped shovel out the school when a heavy snowstorm rolled through. The lights were always on in the school, and they even held safety meetings about switching on the lights before you entered a dark area, so that when you see any hazards that might be hidden in the dark. Even the teachers were instructed not to turn off the lights so the night workers such as myself wouldn't have to go around switching them all back on. This all became a routine, and I never really questioned it until one night I entered a dark room without switching the light on. It was about half an hour before the night shift ended, and I was running a little behind cleaning the windows. I was about to clean a set of double doors when I realized I'd left my glass cleaner in the previous room on the desk near the door. The room was dark, but I didn't really notice because the hallway illuminated the area I needed to go to, and I could see the spray bottle as plain as day. I walked into the room without turning on the lights, and that's when things got a little weird. I didn't step into the room for very long, not even 10 seconds. But for those 10 seconds, I felt something was watching me from the back of the room near the teacher's desk. I shrugged it off and walked back out with my spray bottle in hand and continued cleaning the windows. I decided to ask one of my coworkers about the lights and all the rules associated with keeping the buildings lit at all times. Keith, why are there so many rules associated with the lights in this place? I walked in a room without putting on the lights and everything's fine. Keith, who was always a sarcastic and funny person, stopped eating and stared me down as if I'd just told him his mother had died.
What do you mean you walked into a room without turning on the lights?
His stare was burning a hole right through me. I could tell immediately that I had messed up. The problem was, I didn't know why. What I mean is that I'd left the spray bottle in a room and I walked in and grabbed it. I didn't turn the lights on. Look, everyone's being really vague about this and not telling me shit about why we need to leave every friggin' light on until we leave the building. I came across like a prick, but I was seriously tired about having people tell me to never enter a room without lights on, but not explaining it all to me. I wanted to know. Keith looked down at his food and shook his head and threw out what was left on his plate. He got up slowly and began to walk out of the room, where he stopped and looked at me.
Kid, just listen to us old-timers. Turn the lights off as you finish a room, and make sure you don't have to go back. Go finish my section and keep yourself in the light. I'm going to fix your section and hope it's not too late.
I watched him walk out of the room and head towards my half of the building. It only took me a few minutes to finish off Keith's section and put away his supplies. I made sure I didn't leave anything in any of his rooms, and I shut off the lights as I made my way back into the break room. It was 5 minutes until we were supposed to clock out, and Keith wasn't back from my section. I wasn't worried at first because Keith was always a slow worker, but when our clock out time came and went, I became a little concerned. You see, both custodians had to be done with their job before they could leave. Keith was the only one who had the arming code for the building security, so I was stuck staying there until Keith finished up. I waited another 10 minutes, occasionally checking my watch while I poked my head out of the main hall. Nothing. No Keith. It was now 11:15, and it was getting late for both of us. I had enough and decided to find Keith myself and get him to hurry up on whatever he was doing. I quickly left the break room with a hurried pace toward my section. I didn't hear a vacuum or any type of movement coming from the direction, which had me wondering all sorts of things. What if Keith fell and hurt himself? What if Keith had a heart attack? What if Keith was taking a giant dump? I turned the corner and stopped. Everything was wrong. Everything was so very, very wrong. My entire section was dark. Keith was adamant about keeping the lights on, and he was obviously pissed off that I had walked into a room without switching them on. Why the hell would he be in the entire section with the lights off? I walked over to the light switches for the hallway and flicked them on. They flickered. They never flicker. It took a moment, but eventually the flickering stopped and the hallway was completely illuminated. I slowly walked down the hallway towards the classrooms. I would put on the lights in each room, poke my head in, and looked for signs of Keith. After passing the first few rooms, I came to the room I had entered without the lights on. I turned on the light and walked in. Keith was slumped over the teacher's desk and he was whimpering. I slowly walked over to him and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Keith, you okay?" I asked, my skin covered in goosebumps. Keith pulled his face from his hands, and I gasped at what I saw. His face was covered with scratches and cuts. He was missing an eye and most of his hair had been torn out. There was dried blood everywhere. "What the fuck, Keith? What happened? How?" I asked, panicked. Keith was still whimpering. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. It rang only once and connected me. I explained everything to the operator, and she assured me that an ambulance and a police officer would be there momentarily, and that I should stay on the line. It wasn't long before emergency services showed up, and I led them to the room. Keith was placed on a stretcher and loaded into the waiting ambulance. I called my boss and explained to him what had happened, leaving out the bit about me walking into a dark room and the hallways being dark. My boss instructed me to leave the lights on and to arm the building using his code, and the morning crew will take care of whatever cleanup there is. I wrote down his code, proceeded back to the break room where we also armed the building, set the alarm, and left. As I pulled my car around the building to get to the main road, I had to stop. All the lights were off in the entire building. Not a single exterior light was on. Not a single exit sign was illuminated. It was so dark. I called my boss again, but it went straight to the voicemail, so I left a message explaining what I was seeing. After I left the voicemail, I drove home with goosebumps still crawling all over my skin. The next day, I received a phone call from my boss telling me that I had been suspended until further notice. And not even 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail stating my termination due to negligence. Keith never made it. He passed away shortly after everything happened. According to this paper, he had a heart attack and died peacefully in his sleep. It didn't mention him losing his eye or anything about the school at all. It didn't mention anything out of the ordinary. It's been a whole month since this all went down. I wouldn't even be sharing this if it wasn't for what I had experienced last night. I went to visit a friend who happened to live about a block from that school. It was about 11:30 at night, and I decided to stop by the school since I knew nobody was there. I just wanted to see if there was anything that could explain what the hell happened that night, or if everything was just me losing my mind. I pulled into the main parking lot that sits adjacent to my former section. I regret doing that. And the minute I pulled in, everything was wrong. And I knew right then and there that I shouldn't have been there. The lights were off. The side entrances were open. And there was what looked like to be Keith standing in the doorway. He was waving. No. He was beckoning me. I got the hell out of there and never went back.